Hello everyone, welcome back to our class. I'm always very thankful for you as you take the time to join us for these sessions. And again, I really hope that they have been a blessing to you. Now we are quickly approaching the end of this series of studies, and we're getting to kind of the climax of some of the important things we've been speaking about concerning Israel and their history from just before, during, and after the New Testament period. So today we're going to be looking at the conditions in Israel that led to the rebellion against Rome that eventually led, of course, to the first Jewish-Roman War. So today's class, not very much excitement in it, not very much action, but it's important to get the background of the conditions in Israel that led to this rebellion. Now, as you would know, and as we've been saying over the past classes, around 63 BC, Rome became the dominant force over Israel, and they ruled over Israel, and that continued for a few hundred years. So for the period from the time the Lord Jesus was born all the way through to his ministry and his death and resurrection, ascension to heaven, the time of the Acts of the Apostles, and just after that, all during that time, Rome was ruling over Israel. And so from 63 BC, we come to AD 66, about 130 years after Rome initially took over. And all during that time, the Jews were under the oppression of Rome. And of course, they were seeking at several points to throw off the yoke of Rome, but they never did. And so by the time we get to 66 AD, conditions are such that a rebellion is just about to take place. Now, there are some conditions that existed in Israel that caused this rebellion to be likely to happen. And we're just going to go through a few of those so that you are aware of the background. Firstly, there were conditions in Israel relating to the Roman and Jewish religious conflict. Now, the Jewish religion, as you would know, is a very unique religion, and it was very unique among all the other religions that existed back in that time. And so there was always a sense of the Jews not being able to fit in with other cultures because of their peculiar religious beliefs. And because of their peculiar beliefs, there was always some conflict from that standpoint with the Roman and the Romans who were living with them in Israel. Now, Rome, when it comes to forces that were invading and were in charge of areas, Rome was actually not too bad when it came to that. Unlike the story we told about Antiochus Epiphanes some classes ago, Rome was not one to come and force you to change your religion to conform to theirs. They were quite happy to allow you to continue your religious beliefs, as long as, of course, you don't do anything to offend them or to speak against them, really, on the emperor. But they would allow you to continue your religious beliefs. They didn't try to force you to conform to their beliefs. Now, typically for other nations, this was not a problem, because most other nations would have beliefs where they would believe in multiple gods. And so when Rome took over their particular nation, they would just incorporate Roman gods along with their normal gods, and all would be fine. Of course, that was not the case with the Jews. The Jews not only insisted that they would worship only one God, they also insisted that there was indeed only one true God, and that all other gods were false. And of course, that in itself would create some conflict with other cultures, and particularly, as in this case, the Romans. And the Jews had some unique practices. For example, they maintained a Sabbath, which means that on one day of every week, they would not work. That was unique. In those days, people thought, well, these guys, what is it that they're doing? These people are lazy. They rest for a whole day. But it was, of course, part of their religious belief. They practiced circumcision. which to the Romans seemed to be a very barbaric practice. And of course, they had all their dietary practices as well. They didn't eat pork, which was a very staple part of the Roman diet. And so there was these different things that caused ongoing conflict in Israel between the Romans who were there and the Jewish people. And that always, was always part of the instability of the society because of those conflicts that were always persisting. The Jews, though, did one thing. They always did, as part of their religious practices, have a sacrifice for the emperor. They weren't sacrificing to the emperor, they were sacrificing for him. This would be equivalent to, for example, a church today having a service to pray for the government, right? So something like that, but they will have a daily sacrifice for the emperor. And that's important because I'll mention it again later on in the class. So apart from this religious tension, around, again, AD 66, there was a whole new set of leaders in Rome, and these leaders were not very interested in enforcing rule of law and discipline in society. In fact, they seem to be very much interested only in getting money for themselves and enriching themselves, and generally a whole grift for themselves, getting rich off their position. At this time, there was a procurator by the name of Gessius Florus, and again, remember that name because we'll come back to him again later. But he was the procurator, and again, he was a man who didn't seem to be very interested in things running efficiently or any such thing. He just seemed to be out to get money for himself, and that happened quite a bit in Israel. Around the time also, because there was no real discipline, no real attention to rule of law, there was quite a bit of banditry and instability in the society. The Romans weren't patrolling as they normally did to maintain law and order, and you had this kind of unsettled feeling of things just not being ruled in a disciplined manner, almost getting to the point of anarchy. Not quite anarchy, but almost to that point, where there's these bandits running around and people feel unsafe, and so all that was happening in society as well. And then thirdly, as it relates to the Romans themselves, don't forget this is now 66 AD, and 2 years earlier there was the Great Fire in Rome, Nero's Great Fire in Rome, 64 AD, and Nero needed money to rebuild Rome and to build his house of gold and other things that he wanted to build. And so taxes were very high. And so again, people in Israel were being forced to pay high taxes to fund Nero's rebuilding of Rome, and also the normal Roman army and their conquests and so on, the wars that they were fighting. So they needed money, and so all their subjects were being taxed heavily, including Israel. So you can see high taxation, lack of discipline, anarchy almost, banditry going on, conflict from the religious perspective. All of this led to a general instability in society, which made it ripe for rebellion. But it was not only the conflict with the Romans. There are, as always, internal conflicts as well. And so there was internal conflict between the Jews themselves. First of all, in this period of time, the Jews were still very much looking for the appearance of their Messiah. Now, of course, we looking back now know that their Messiah had already come and returned to heaven, the Lord Jesus Christ. But they didn't accept that at the time, and they were still looking for a Messiah. So they were still expecting someone to appear on the scene at any time to deliver them from the Romans. And so there was always this expectation of, we are going to soon be throwing off the Romans. So you had that feeling among the Jews. And then you had different sects within the Jews. You had the Pharisees, who were kind of moderate. They, of course, they wanted to get rid of the Romans as well, but they were more willing to get along with the Romans and say, well, look, these guys are in charge, we'll just get along with them. Hopefully we can get ourselves some positions of power and authority by doing so. And so they were, willing to be moderate and to get along with the Romans. But there was another group called the Zealots, which I'm sure you've heard of. The Zealots were the more aggressive people. They were looking to overthrow the Romans by force of arms. And so you had the Zealots who were constantly in conflict with the Pharisees and the other groups because they had different perspectives as to how Israel and the Jews should be responding to the Roman rule. And the conflict was very great. It wasn't that they were just had differences of opinion. They will also be physically fighting amongst each other to the point where they will be killing each other. Which brings me to a third group, because if you thought the Zealots were bad, you probably have never heard of the group called the Sicarii. The Sicarii were the extreme arm of the Zealots. The name Sicarii comes from the word which means small or little dagger. And so the Sicarii, essentially, that name means dagger men. So we were the men who carry daggers. And what? These are men who literally did that. They walked around with these small knives, these small daggers, and they would assassinate their political rivals. So their modus operandi would be that they would go into a crowded area like a marketplace, and they would have their knife in their robes, and they would target their opponent, their enemy, whoever it is that they wanted to kill, their target, and they would go to them quietly and take out the knife and stab them, normally killing them. And then they would quickly put away the knife and we started to say, look, this poor fellow has been injured, help, and call people to come and help him. And when the crowd comes around and everything, they would quietly slip away and make their escape. And that's how the Sicarii worked. They were like like I said, the extreme arm of the Zealots. And they were looking for war with the Romans as well. The thing about these Sicarii was that sometimes they would be arrested, but because the Roman leadership was so much focused on grift and making money for themselves, you just had to pay them some money and they would release these guys back out on the streets. So you had all this, again, going on, this tension and this unruliness happening in society. And so those were the conditions that existed in Israel just around 66. AD 66, and those are the situations where the prospect of a rebellion and something happening, some explosion happening, was very ripe, and there was a spark that then set off the rebellion, and the spark comes next. So now we've seen the conditions in Israel. They were just waiting for a spark, something that would be a catalyst for the rebellion to start. And the spark came in 66 AD. Now, interestingly, it didn't happen in Jerusalem. It was actually an event in Caesarea that we mentioned before, that this is where the spark initially occurred. And it was a fairly mundane type situation. There were a group of Jews living in Caesarea, and apparently they were renting a space somewhere, a building or a room in the building, to be used as a synagogue. And the owner of this space, a non-Jew, apparently wanted to evict them. But they wanted to buy the property. Of course, this owner did not want to sell, he wanted to evict them. But it seems as though they had some kind of agreement, because they said that they will take their case to the man in charge, the procurator, who we mentioned before, a man called Gessius Florus. So they took their case to Florus and said, look, we have this agreement, and this person wants to evict us. We want you to step in and rule on the matter. Now, in those days, you couldn't just go to court. You had to pay some money to the person who you wanted to rule in your matter. So Florus said, of course, I will look into your matter. Just please pay me the requisite amount of money, and I will look into your case for you. And so they did. They got the money, and they paid it to Gessius Florus, who then immediately proceeded to ignore them and to ignore their case altogether. So they were already upset. But then, even beyond that, someone, not sure who it is, did something to even provoke the situation even more. That person, whoever they was, took a set of birds and perform a Greek religious sacrifice of these birds on the just in front the property that was being rented for the synagogue. So, before going into all the details, the Jews considered that to be offensive. In fact, they considered it to be a defilement of their property. And at that point, there was some eruption, some fairly minor violence took place. The Jews were protesting. Of course, Flores, being a Roman, wasn't too much in favor of the Jews. So when this little flare-up took place, he came down with a very heavy hand and arrested not the person who did the sacrifice, but he arrested the Jews who were complaining. And his response, as I said, was very heavy-handed. So of course, the Jews were complaining. They weren't very happy with this situation, and it started to get a bit out of hand. Now, word spread to the Jews in Jerusalem of what happened to their brethren in Caesarea, and that started a turmoil there as well, as they were very upset with what has happened to their brethren. Again, Flores responded with a very heavy hand, and he had, again, the Jews that were starting to protest and to start some violence, had them arrested. He had many of them whipped, and he had some of them crucified. There was actually a very large number of them that were killed by Flores and his soldiers as a result of this. And of course, that made the situation even worse. But even beyond that, Flores decided that once he was there in Jerusalem with his soldiers, he was going to take the opportunity to raid the temple and to take whatever money he could find in the temple, to take that, I guess, for himself. But he made the argument that he was taking it for the emperor. And he ended up taking up a relatively small amount of money, maybe something in the order of a couple $100 in our currency today. Very small amount of money. And the Jews, of course, were not very pleased with that. And so they did something. They started to kind of mock him. And so many of the Jews walked about the city with their hats in their hand, begging for money for Flores, because they were saying, well, this man is so poor, he has to raid our temple, he doesn't have any money, let's, please give money to help him, please. And they walked about begging for money as a means of mocking Flores. Of course, that didn't go down too well with Flores, and again, he responded by having many of the Jews arrested, and by this point, it was getting to get out of hand. There was a rapid rise in the level of violence. All the Jews were protesting. It was all happening. As I said, Flores called out his army, and they actually killed a large number of the Jews even around this time. Like I said, he had many of them whipped, had many of them crucified, and that all added to the general level of anger in the society. And so now, the rebellion was well and truly on. And now, violence is spreading, the rebellion is well and truly on. Large amounts of Jews are now in the streets. They are fighting against the Romans. They are organizing themselves into a fighting force. And at this point, even the Romans who were stationed in Jerusalem were chased and confined into the Antonia fortress. We mentioned that in an earlier video. But they're essentially there, and they are surrounded by the Jews. They can't escape. Agrippa II, who we also mentioned in a previous video, was the so-called king at the time. And he attempted to intervene and calm the situation. Of course, all the Jews knew and recognized that Agrippa was merely a puppet of the Romans. They had no regard, no respect for him. And so his attempts at pacifying the situation were rebuffed, and he himself was chased out of Jerusalem, eventually ending his days in Rome, as we mentioned that in the previous video as well. The high priest at this time decides that he is going to stop the daily sacrifices to the emperor. You will recall I mentioned that at the start of this class. They had a daily sacrifice to the emperor. The high priest decides he's done with that. No more sacrifices to the emperor. Now this was seen as an insult to the Romans and to the emperor. how do you mean you're not going to be sacrificing for me anymore? And so that was a further cause a further escalation of the feelings of animosity between the two sides, and that also caused an escalation in the violence. So at this point, news reaches Rome to Nero that the Jews are rebelling. They're burning down the place. They are threatening and killing, in some cases, some of the Romans, and they have chased out Agrippa. They've also chased out, by this time, Gessius Florus as well. And so, like I said, the rebellion is well and truly on. So Nero gets word that there's a rebellion in Jerusalem. And as I have mentioned maybe 2 or 3 times already, Israel at that time fell under the administrative domain of Syria. So Nero sends to Syria, to the governor there, and says, take an army down to Jerusalem and quell this rebellion. The man in charge at that point with Syria, a man called Gaius Cestius Gallus, normally just called Cestius Gallus. And he took a legion called the 12th Legion of approximately 20,000 men, and he went to Jerusalem. He surrounds Jerusalem in a siege-like manner, and then he and his troops enter into the city and goes to observe what's happening with this rebellion. Now, there are a couple of stories here because we're not 100% sure what happens. But Cestius Gallus, after entering Jerusalem and seeing what was going on, after about 8 days of a siege, decides that he is going to break up the siege and take his men and retreat, having not really done anything in Jerusalem. There are a couple of theories there. There was one theory that when he saw the massive number of Jews who were rebelling, it was an estimate that there were about 23,000 Jewish men organized in a fighting force at the time. When he saw that force, he got a bit scared, and so he decided to retreat. And there's also another theory that maybe when he went in, when he surrounded Jerusalem and went in, it was more like from his perspective, a show of force. He just wanted to say, look, you guys, here's my army, we have got you surrounded, behave yourselves or we're going to come in and deal with you. But it's just a warning. In any event, we don't show away, but he retreats. He takes his men, the siege is ended, and he and his men retreat. That was a mistake, because the Jews saw that as a victory for themselves, and they're chased after this 12th Legion and Cestius Gallus, led by a man called Shimon Bar Giora. They pursued the Syrian army, and they met them at a place called Beth Horon, and apparently this was an area which was quite narrow, and the only way to get through it was, 2 people at the time had to walk through this narrow area, and the Jews waited for them there and assaulted them, ambushed them, picked them off one by one, and inflicted a massive loss on the Syrian army. In fact, this is one of the, and it says Syrian, obviously the Syrians were under the Romans, so it's essentially, in effect, the Roman army. And this was probably the first time that a Roman army has suffered that amount of damage in a situation like this. Approximately over 5,000, we're told, were killed. And so the Jews routed them. They killed many of them, and not only that, more embarrassingly, they stole all of their supplies, all of their war equipment, all of their war machines, the siege engines and so on that the army had. The Jews stole all of that. And of course that would come in handy to the Jews when the war eventually developed. And so they inflicted a very large and embarrassing defeat on Cestius Gallus and his army. Cestius Gallus himself escapes and returns safely to Syria, but he's quite embarrassed with what has happened. Rome is quite embarrassed by this, and so it's time to get serious. So Nero, now having realized that the Syrian army wasn't really up to it, calls for one of his most experienced generals, a man by the name of Vespasian, who we've talked about in an earlier video. And Vespasian is a very experienced general, having fought a number of wars successfully for Rome. Nero actually didn't like him very much, but he realized that he was a competent and able general. So Nero calls him and assigns him to the task of going to Israel to put down the rebellion. And now this is the start of the first Jewish-Roman war. We'll talk about that war in our next class. Here are my closing thoughts. At the very start of this class, I mentioned how the Jews were seen to be a bit strange by the Romans and indeed by all the surrounding nations because of their beliefs in God and what God asked them to do. And so they were considered to be out of place. They never quite fit in, even though there were many other religions and they all had their different views and whatever. Those others seemed to be, have no conflict. But not the Jews. The Jews always were different. They were a peculiar people, a strange people to the Romans and to the other nations surrounding them. Now that same thought has carried on to us today, who are Christians, because we are seen as a peculiar people. That is even said in the New Testament, in the book of 1 Peter chapter 2 and verse 9, where it says that we are a chosen generation, a royal priesthood, an holy nation, a peculiar people, a strange people, people who don't fit in to the environment. Now, at the time that this video is being recorded, the word weird is being used quite often. It has become quite popular. And some people are being described as weird, and some people are using that as a means of belittling them, I guess. And so people are being called weird a lot these days. Now, if you're being called weird because of some strange or inappropriate behavior, then that's one thing. So if you're being called weird because you want to impose your views on people by force, or because you get fixated with seemingly trivial matters, or because you have no care or compassion for other human beings who are not like you, and if you're being called weird for that, then yeah, I would agree, you are weird. But if you're a Christian and you're being called weird because you do not engage in some of the immoral behaviors that other people seem to engage in, you don't believe in lying and cheating, you believe in loving your neighbor, you believe in treating people humanely regardless of their situation in life, and you believe in showing the love of the Lord Jesus to people. If you're being called weird because of that, then that's a weirdness to be embraced. That is a weirdness that would make you a peculiar person according to the scriptures. And so we can be weird, we can be strange, we can be peculiar if we are following the biblical definition or the biblical prescriptions for Christians, which is to love people. And if we are called weird because of that, then so be it. As Christians, we are not meant to fit in or to conform. We are told to not conform to this world. And so we are to be different. And we are to show people the Lord Jesus Christ by being different, not by being like the world. So we can be peculiar, we can be weird, but only as it is indicated in the Word of God, not by our own definitions. And so I encourage you, seek biblical behaviors in your own life and follow the instructions of the Lord Jesus Christ as to how we should live. And if we are called weird, then so be it. Next class, as I said, we're going to get into the action, the actual war between the Jews and the Romans, which culminated, so to speak, with the invasion and destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70. We'll get to that in our next class, God willing. Until then, God bless you.